part of our inquiry is how do we navigate this world that went from commons to enclosure, that went from animate ways of being and living into thingifying and dehumanizing.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're having conversations about regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. How can we build an economy that's in service to life? Brought to you by Ma Earth. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Lynn Murphy, co-director of Transition Resource Circle and co-author of Post-Capitalist Philanthropy. In this conversation, we get into Lynn's work in the philanthropic sector, where she's been convening and facilitating networks at the edges. And she discusses some of the key messages and observations from her book and of the field. Especially if you're a funder, I think you'll want to check this one out. Let's dive right in with my friend Lynn Murphy. We are here today with my friend Lynn Murphy, co-director of Transition Resource Circle, co-author of Post-Capitalist Philanthropy. We're here at the Bristol Planet Local Summit. Thanks so much for doing this, Lynn. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It's an honor to be here with you.
And how's your conference or summit going so far?
Yeah, some of us haven't done these in a while. Yesterday morning, they started with this framing of global local. And at first I was listening, thinking, did I fall back in time? Wasn't that kind of the framing that we were using kind of 20, 25 years ago when I started working in different arenas around transnational, global, different activism pieces. And I noticed whether I was kind of in judgment or whether I was like catching the threads from the past and listening to where the movements, the discourse, the convergence has gone. And so then today I was feeling like, okay, now we're here. We're in this moment and we're looking at, you know, whatever language you want to call the meta crisis, the poly crisis, and the honor to be with people from truly around the world. A lot of people from the geopolitical South who are living many of what we'll probably get into today that I often refer to as like transition pathways. So yeah, lovely to be in the mix. And I think if those who are listening to this listen to Eleanor, I share the same thing of it's time for us to disrupt the kind of the form and the methodology of conference where there's an expert and a stage and an orientation towards, and more than just kind of speaky and listening. I would say a lot of our culture is so used to receiving such an onslaught of information, and we consume information rather than actually really listen and learn.
Yeah, we had a great discussion with your co-conspirator and brother, Eleanor Lada, co-authored the book with you and co-directs Transition Resource Circle. Folks can listen to that episode once they're done with this one. So you mentioned kind of the work in the field that you've been in for some time. Would love to maybe start by contextualizing your background and how you come into this space.
So many ways to do that. And I've always been bio shy, and yet I love reading them about others. If I look at it, I would say the through line for me has always been one of service. I was raised in a pretty humble beginning, kind of working class, very conservative, what now is called like Pentecostal or evangelical family in California. And what was offered was this path of service. And that felt true for me. And so it took myriad forms, but took me out of my context early and often from a young age. And so the ways that I've been of service have varied from everything from, I think my first job was like as a bilingual teacher in Southern California to being in Central America at different times after the wars and working with undocumented folks around slums and learning what is community development to going back and figuring out there was this thing called graduate school and doing too much of
Mm.
more years of schooling. And then that brings you into the field of research and scholarship. And so a lot of the work there I was doing was around global movements, the debt relief movement and other things that started back now over 2 decades ago, and the anti-globalization movement. And that started work in sub-Saharan Africa after years of Central America and then South Asia. And at that time, I was working a lot on what I was then somehow found my way into, I guess I should say after that, is there was a foundation that asked me to work with them originally as a consultant, and then it turned into a very formal job, as I like to say. And so I spent a couple years as a senior fellow with the Hewlett Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and then I was a program officer and entrusted with extraordinary amounts of other people's money through the apparatus of philanthropy to the remit at the time was, how do you improve schooling for the poorest children? So I spent some years doing that. And so that was in the international development system in philanthropy, working with NGOs, and took that job that was offered to me. I didn't apply for it, with lots of questions about the modernity, schooling, international development, the NGO industrial complex, philanthropy being technocratic, rational, kind of looking towards positivist, kind of giving grants, deciding where those grants can go, absent relationality. Entered the doors, did that work, and then very consciously resigned. Fell apart, learned a whole bunch of other things. Met you somewhere along the way and got entangled with Al Noor. And here we are reflecting back on its Transition Resource Circle, philanthropy, and this moment that we're in, and how I would say how I can be of service now.
Mm-hmm. And it's so funny to see that you come back to philanthropy. How is your lens, really oriented, and maybe start to unpack a bit of the views and the threads of TRC, Transition Resource Circle, and Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, the book?
Yeah, it's a funny thing when you step out of philanthropy, and I ended up being asked to continue to work with philanthropy. And I kept seeing in that, both when I was in it and stepped out, that I felt like both a epistemological institutional straitjacket. There was only so far we could go with knowledge claims, with deep questions, with questioning the notion of philanthropy itself. At the time that I was there was a small but very limited conversation around divestments of endowments. That movement grew, but the large foundations, and I happened to work with one of them, largely couldn't see where those endowments funds would go. So I was seeing a very static, kind of self-reinforcing notion, and not a lot of move within the institutional frame and within the logic of it itself. And of course, philanthropy understands that it consolidates power and has power, and that there's something about that. We'll talk about the U.S. context for a moment, that you have to pay 5% of the endowment, and that's a legal agreement. And so it needs grantees in that way. And yet what I found with philanthropy is it likes to be kind of, I almost feel like, whacked, but it doesn't like to change anything, or it actually can't really change. And so I really didn't imagine that I was going to end up coming back around to post-capitalist philanthropy. And yet something about the journey that I went on to understand soma, to look at trauma, to try to get out of the world, as I often will say, that is either written by Adam Smith or Karl Marx, but to try to find more of an ecological other way of understanding how to be of response and in service in this moment, led me back into wanting to do, truth-telling sounds too hubris and grandiose, but actually have a more honest, reflective conversation about what is it within the system of philanthropy that is still holding on to all of this wealth, that is still investing endowments in extractive capitalism, that is still giving away a tiny percent in grants, that still isn't really radically changing the institutional culture, it to be responsive to our times. And so with that provocation, when Al Noor and I met and he asked me to come alongside of a gathering in 2017 when he was running the rules, and then said, hey, we have something to do together. Let's do one more gathering in November of 2019. Exactly. There was like, sure, I'll show up for this. And what I felt like what we could offer at that time was, how does our inner world reflect our outer world? And how do we consider the proposition that we need to blend a spiritual political praxis? So it's this inner and outer mirroring and understanding kind of this political spiritual praxis that led us into this inquiry of what is the work of Transition Resource Circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was at that gathering, and I had experimented up until that point with different forms of attendance at giving circles hosted by donor advised funds, philanthropy gatherings and conferences, different types of thematic giving areas, and I always thought it was really enticing to try to sit in a circle with other funders and say, okay, like, how are we mobilizing resources and defining what our shared aims are? What are we learning together? And, those who occupy the role of funders, I think it's a very unique, small niche. And so finding the others and comparing notes and learning together is like, it seems pretty obvious that it would be worthwhile. And I always left those circles like just kind of depleted and disillusioned and frankly questioning whether I should spend any energy in philanthropy. And to no fault of any of the organizers or any of the attendees, it just, it felt administrative and bureaucratic. Like often the people in the circle weren't the ones that were fully entrusted because everything kind of deferred to, well, our board, or well, the other trustees and but mostly also that the questions were just not nearly radical enough, that we weren't going deep enough into the crisis that we face. And I think Transition Resource Circle for me was one of the first times where I found a group of people that it doesn't mean I agreed with everything that everyone was saying. It doesn't mean that it, completely transformed my life, whatever, but it was a moment in time at that 2019 gathering where it was like, okay, this is resonant insofar as it's having brave, honest conversations about the capital, about all of the stacks of the capital, not just the grants, but the endowments, about the worldviews in which are underneath that are shaping it, about how the money was made to begin with and what that contextualizes for the future, about what types of movements to be in solidarity with, and who else is coming to these shared conclusions. And it wasn't just funders. You had in those circles activists and people from, I think, probably predominantly the global South, which was also rare to find people with those voices and who are very sharp and sophisticated. So anyway, I offer that as a bit of my context as well into this this conversation with you. Can you share more about, what are some of the key learnings and messages and that also compelled you to write a book?
Maybe it's useful to just say kind of why we even say something, what we mean by transition, what we mean by resource and circle as a way into the inquiries in the book of what we explore. So when we speak of transitions, what we're looking at is all the ways that, back to the inner and outer, all of the ways that we have systems that are rooted in domination and exploitation. If folks have listened to Alnor or others, there's a recognition that we all have a little inner capitalist inside of us. We all have a little part of ourselves that is constantly in a process of exploitation and domination, and that those also are reflected outer. They're reflected in our relationships, in our culture, in our institutions, all the way up to this sector we're talking about of philanthropy as both a beneficiary of late-stage capitalism, as an upholder of it, and as an externality of the same logics that we all walk in. The other way we speak about this with transitions is sometimes like we often will talk about memetics and narrative structures, and there's a word called wetiko, which which there's a whole beautiful book that's written about it, but it's kind of, there's the Western Occidental mind and way of being has a communicable mind virus disease called Wetiko, and it's like the inner cannibal. And it's kind of that we all feel that there is something about us that has a bottomless pit for greed, and the opposite side of that of scarcity. And underneath that is a lot of fear. So we're actively looking at how do we transition out of systems rooted in domination and exploitation towards ones that are life affirming, towards ones that are congruent with life and death cycles, towards ones that are more in relationality with, perhaps we could go into the Gaian, entelechy, or the more animate field, but that which we all kind of know is not working in this moment. And so then we invoke resources, saying that there's something about the hoarding of wealth that's happening right now, and the myriad ways that we can reimagine resources to be in service of life. And so what that looks like. And one of our provocations is that how can we use capital to liberate capital, lean into the paradox, lean into the contradiction in this moment to move in ways that can support life. And the circle is to recognize that this is not going to come through some sophisticated strategy that a few people come up with, that there's the hubris of we know the way. We're actively trying to disrupt the paradigm of problem solution and the smartest one wins, but to recognize that there's circle ways. There's other ways of knowing and being. There's ways of coming together in a more, I say circle and I almost feel yin, like the water that's going to help guide us in how to do this. And so that's kind of been the inquiry ground of Transition Resource Circle. And as we went along with this, we didn't do the first gathering in November 2019 of like, now we have a new project. We did it as an offering. And then there was a desire for continued accompaniment. So Alnor and I were in this call and response of listening and said, okay, I guess we keep going. And so we set up what we call a temporary organizational zone. So we have this lovely fiscal sponsor, but we're in this, let's see how long this offering serves. And then we had a funder come to us and say, if I accept the premises, and this is some of the key lines of, this is not my wealth, nor is it the institutional's wealth. This is the world's collective endowment gotten through ill-gotten gains, through extraction, through domination. There are implications for that. There are consequences for that. And so what would I do if I agree with some of your premises? What does that mean? And we looked at each other and said, well, we're not necessarily folks who can guide you on where investments go. So actually, this means we need to step back and really consider what are the propositions that we're offering. So what is post-capitalism, and what might philanthropy as a transition itself even look like in an era that we're moving out of systems of domination towards ones that honor life. And so in the book, we kind of explore things like, what does that look like? What are those transition pathways? What does it mean to move out of individual or institutional entitlements to collective entanglements or collective stewardship? What does it mean to be a wealth hoarder at you could say the end of times? And we're not trying to invoke some sort of apocalyptic notion, but we're meaning, I know you've talked with others about where we are with crossing a lot of planetary boundaries, the meta crises, collapsing scenarios. So what does it mean to continue to amass monies in those moments that actually aren't already responding to those who are living, I would say, almost like the post-capitalist scenarios right now?
Yeah, so well said. Our dear beloved Yael Morantz helped us with the frame of rewilding resources at Biome Trust, a philanthropic trust that I'm affiliated with. And yeah, it's this nod to the context that extraction of Mother Earth to turn life into capital and to call it resources, and to also refer to our living world as resources in the ground, natural resources, etc. That a frame for philanthropy that we like to play with is like, okay, so what does it mean to rewild that, to return it back to life, to be in service back to our living world? Obviously, we also take a predominantly kind of ecological lens to types of organizations and projects that we're in service to. You mentioned the circle work, and having sat in circle with you, I know that this is one of the key gifts that you offer, and I also know it's a trained skill born of much experience. And so I'm wondering if you could share more about that and your background into that.
Mm. Oh, I didn't expect such a question, Matthew. Let me see.
You got to keep throwing in some curveballs.
Exactly. It's great. Yeah, there's something, when I left the foundation and the first thing I did was I felt like there's something about, I had studied social movements, I had tried to fund social movements, and all of that brought me back to actually human movement. And I went and did a very deep study of human movement and modalities to better understand the mind-body connection, because my hunch was that we can't quite grok where nature is because we are so disassociated. We live in hundreds of years of what we could say of the age of enlightenment. I also would call the age of disembodiment, that has led us into a place where, I mean, we're even losing peripheral vision. The way we even write, we have fewer and fewer neural pathways that are moving through the body. This has like direct consequences with I would offer the intellectual agility that we have right now. What's going on with the size of the brain, what's going on with our sense of space, what's going on with our sense with one another. So I knew that I had to find other modalities and other ways of being and knowing. And so it started in this study of human movement in this system called Laban-Bartini. If I'm an actual movement analyst, we could have a conversation about the conversation between our bodies right now, but I won't go there.
No.
And I also was honored to have been brought into a lineage that's a counsel practice. And so the lineage that I have been able to walk with is from the Ojai Foundation and carriers of the nature of counsel, and had some elders in that space and really sat with what is this ancient technology of sitting in circle and what is really listening, not just hearing, not just sharing words, but active listening. And that led me into seeing these animate fields and also deepening into my contemplative practice in a daily way of how am I actually quiet. And even as you offer a question, and right now, can I listen, not just hear or regurgitate? And there's a whole bunch of other modalities that came through those kinds of studies of how do we sit in circle? How do we disrupt the usual habituated way that we're exchanging information or extracting information or consuming information so something else can happen? And as adults, we often think that we are learning. And actually, for us to learn, we have to be uncomfortable. We have to actually be in this discomfort zone, not in the panic and not in the like, hey, I'm going to hang back and chill. But there's something about almost an agitation that disrupts us, that gets us into a place of learning. So I find that if you bring a bunch of different people together in circle and you have to pay attention, like there's going to be enough discomfort if people are from different lineages, from different parts of the world, and you trust that rather than try to go for, I know that you've had conversations with Bio and he was problematizing the notion of inclusion. So you're not trying to find the lowest common denominator. You're trying to find common ground enough so something else can come in. Then I would say the other piece about circle ways is trusting that we're ever in an animate field. And so we're listening to the more than human. We're listening beyond our usual ways of being and knowing. And whatever serves that, I'm all in. Yep.
So how are you bringing this into now this space of helping or seeking or in the inquiry of how do we use capital to liberate capital? Because obviously a lot of those forms of being in circle, of being in the field of animism, for listening to what wants to emerge across, different stakeholders is, it's difficult in these institutional forms that we have, either, wearing our organizational hats or sitting, in committees or being entangled in hierarchical structures. So yeah, I'm curious what you've drawn from that circle time and how you think about those medicines in service to the inquiry around capital.
May feel like a non sequitur, but as you were asking the question, what kept coming, and maybe it's because we're here in the UK, is what was the commons before enclosure came? And I kept feeling like, what was it when there wasn't, boundaries, and there was something else there, and reflecting on the process that happened. That I know Alnor did a really beautiful, deep articulation of where we find ourselves in capitalism. So I won't do that. What I do think about is the intentionality that came in to dehumanize so you could justify slavery and genocide, and to kind of stamp out animism so you could thingify the cup, the table, the mineral, the quote unquote resource of the ancient growth tree. And so part of our inquiry is, how do we navigate this world that went from commons to enclosure, that went from animate ways of being and living into thingifying and dehumanizing? And so what I feel like with the circle ways is it brings us back into acknowledging that we're not in just the hierarchical structure. We talk about the pyramid logic in the book, that we're not just in a inevitability of power over. And it's something about the interconnected relationality. And often I don't want to just be hokey and say power with, but there's something about understanding reciprocal relationships and a call and response that is what we're trying to grapple with in these inquiries, of moving from kind of wherever capture is what the way I think about enclosure. So we could talk about endowments as capture. We could talk about institutional codification as capture, into how that starts to open up. It feels like monies right now are held behind a dammed wall. And how do you start to move that, take that dam where we have funds flowing, not flooding, into the places that they want to go? And that's part of what we explore in the book, and have a whole bunch about some coordinates of possibility. Again, kind of more of a circular orientation, inner and outer, about how that might look.
And you have this beautiful map and these coordinates. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So as we sat with if we're going to say use capital to liberate capital, and acknowledging that there's a lot of movements happening right now that are in the frame of justice or the just transition movement, we sat with, what is it if we're actually talking about getting out of the world of form and material, and getting out of the logic that has dominated, or what I talked about of disassociative kind of hyper rationality under the age of enlightenment. So that led us into justice plus ontological shifts. And so I say that because this is kind of the background condition to move into what we offer as the coordinates of possibility.
And what so I mean sorry to interrupt you. Can you define ontological?
I was just gonna go there. So what we mean by ontological shifts, or onto shifts, if you want to be super geeky, and is ontology. The simplest way to say it is the very way that we see reality. So I, as in there's a perception that there's a separate Lynn sitting over here gazing at a person that I would call Matthew, and that is a separate human, and it's the way I see reality. And if I'm in an ontological shift, can I perceive that there's this being that's coming through? Who knows if my ancestors are talking through me? Who knows if there's some sort of leftover other voices in this room that are coming through? There's a relationality that's happening between us right now. I'm aware of the waters that are in my body, the gut biome, that's maybe the food that I ate today is informing what is coming through in this moment. And there's a whole bunch more about what we talk about, of getting out of the notions of a separate materialistic rational as the only way that we see, and bringing more into the relationality, into the animate, into the interbeingness, that there is a way that we are ever in dialogue with, I don't just say the more than human, the plants. I actually mean like, I'm nodding out to like quantum and quantum ethics, that there's something beyond what we can perceive. So this is the background of how we came up with this, our subjective view of what some coordinates of possibility are. And I said how we came up with, and I want to just pause there and say it wasn't that we came up with anything. It was actually in a lot of conversations with many people and with many different knowledge systems and wisdom traditions. And so what we offer is something called the 5 elements mandala, and a mandala to acknowledge the inner and the outer journey. And also we kind of anchor our coordinates of possibility around different elements. So we start with the air element. That's actually up here. And that's where we're speaking to creating new ancient emerging cultures. And so often, we've all heard it said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So what is it that's like, we're in a real impoverishment of the collective imaginary. You know, we see so many dystopia movies or future sci-fi that are all the world ended and now what? Or they're kind of back to showing us when the Vikings took over. You know, we don't have a lot of other ways of seeing how society, how culture, how we could be living together. So this is the work of, you mentioned our beloveds with the Culture Hack Labs and others who are really working on narratives and in that space, and the artists and others who are showing us that there's something in the collective imaginary. So that's all the element of air. And the bottom of the mandala is where we talk about creating post-capitalist infrastructure. So back to this notion of using capital to liberate capital. We need to see like much more monies, and I would say the endowments and others moving, because they're not tied to the grant structure, into land-based projects. So we can see bioregional kind of cultural health, education, cultural sovereignty flourishing, that we can see that happen like now. So we're not waiting for crisis after crisis, and then we're trying to backfill. And I should also say, not to necessarily just look at the maps with the most biodiversity and with our limited predictive capacity of the future. It's in relationality that some of these decisions are made. And this gets us to the other part of the mandala. So the other piece is the water element. And here we talk about solidarity with Indigenous peoples. So here I mentioned this piece of justice plus ontological shifts, because I can't just assert solidarity. I can't assert solidarity with Indigenous peoples, but it's acknowledging that there are people who've been tending biodiversity places, that have been tending the waterways, that are kind of tending the bloodlines, if you will, of the earth. And what is it to be in solidarity? This is an ever ongoing praxis. It is a way that I have to live, and it is not a one time and it's done. It is not just give a grant. It is having to listen at a subtle level and stay in the relationality for what is. So this is part of the water element. And the other side of that is fire. And there we talk about solidarity with social movements, especially in the world's majority. Those that are actually pointing out what's happening as a consequence of late-stage capitalism, continued land grabs, mining, now lithium, whatever it is, there's always movements that are helping show the way. And if we actually, again, live what it is to be in solidarity with them, not just supporting the social movements that I may want to support or the ones that I have a particular preference for, but a lived praxis, that's going to bring us into this justice plus onto shifts and help us to start to see some coordinates of possibility. And it all moves around the element of ether. And here is where it might sound to some as mystical. And I think that's because our culture actually has a lot of amnesia and is deeply disconnected from life force itself. And so here we're really speaking about a reclamation of life force. And so it's the work of trauma, but not trauma to just deal with your trauma so you can be a better citizen in modernity and continue in the house of capitalism. But it's to acknowledge that there's something that we have bypassed. And I would say those of us who've been brought up in a Western tradition, it's almost like we've thwarted life force itself. I won't go into the diatribe of the colonization of mind and body through schooling and modernity, but it literally has bred passivity in our bodies, in the way that we sit in chairs, in it's mediating all of our existence all the time, whether we actually can acknowledge that everything comes through life force, all of life, and we've thwarted that. And so this is where the work of initiation, rather than a culture of trauma, we talked about a culture of initiation, where we would suggest that there's a need for mystery schools and other ways of being and knowing that come through that help guide us into listening to what are coordinates of possibility. And perhaps the other thing to say about this is we're speaking about this as transition pathways. So if we're in an ongoing practice of really reckoning with shifting the very way we see reality itself, ontology, we're engaging with what that tells us about our worldview or cosmology. We're actually being students of our culture and what it is. These days we hear a lot of words like decolonize or deschool, but we're actively trying to disrupt something that's allowing some other way for us to be in relationality and with life itself. If all of this is happening, then this onto shifting, these coordinates of possibility, we'll start to live what we call transition pathways that gesture towards something that's a post-capitalist realities that we don't actually know what that looks like. So all of this is a recognition, back to the transition, is that we're actively not trying to solutionize our way out of this, because that's going to or save our way out of this, or be nihilistic out our way out of this. It's what's the humble way that we can find a transition and the next step, and the next step and the next step. And then we often talk about perhaps we're in an initiatory moment as a species, crossing a threshold, walking each other through the unknown.
So this map offers a bit of a compass and helps gesture towards some of these possible transition pathways. You did a lot of research for the book. You talked to a lot of folks in the philanthropic industrial complex. And I'm curious if you can point to any examples of where you feel funders living this path.
That's a very good question. And I say a really good question because it's the question we get a lot, and really good because I often feel humble about even suggesting where it comes through, because I recognize it's coming through a subjective view. And there's some movement in this direction. I was thinking about, we see a lot of conversations these days about reparations. We see folks, on the endowment side, there's been some conversation about divest. There's been some conversation about spend down or impact investing. All of those are still framed. It feels like in a justice or kind of in a material phenomenological world. We're not seeing a lot that actually is in this kind of onto shifting kind of notion. There are a few places that are living this, and I'm entangled with a wonderful Danae elder who, as you know as well, who recently, it's hard to even say gifted. I would say like there was almost a reparations that happened where monies came to her for her to, with others in her tribe, to get the land around their ceremonial mountain. This is, for me, an example of this transition pathway. And they were listening with the mountain, with the lands, with that, because we're still caught in legal instruments of donor advised funds and who has the ownership. So even if you're not really wanting to do ownership, you're still caught in the instruments of capital. It's why I talk about transitions rather than it's just a magic trick to jump over to post-capitalist realities. But it was informed by something else. And then the forms, how the monies flow, what the legal instruments, what the holdings were, flowed from that. And so that's what I see mostly is it's trying to move towards that. Like a lot of the reparations funds are a deep acknowledgement of what And that work needs to continue and happen. But it's still very much caught in material form. If I give X dollars to X community, and it's not actually doing the more subtle work of healing the inner conditions of what it is that we've all been living, exploitation and domination. So it's to say the work is nascent. It's happening. It's happening. I think there's a lot of people in the geopolitical South who live what we often will talk about as post-capitalist values, who've been living transition pathways, whether it be because of climate collapse or hyperinflation, or what happened during COVID with a reemergence of a lot of mutual aid networks and solidarity that came. So there's that work that's happened. That work isn't necessarily tied to the very large amounts of capital that are held in the geopolitical North. And then there's places that I think are actually living towards what we're pointing towards that don't get philanthropic funding, places like Rojava or the Zapatistas, who actively kind of step out of a certain polity and who've been living for a very long time other ways of knowing and organizing capital, and they're often rooted in another kind of cosmology and orientation.
Mm. Mm. Are there other frameworks or maps in the book that you could speak to?
I paused for a moment because I'm perhaps channeling my inner Al-Noor for a moment to say that we wondered whether or not to put, the 5-element mandala to put an offering of what coordinates of possibility is, because you end up almost like codifying a framework.
Yeah, it becomes too prescriptive.
Exactly. We worked with some wonderful graphic artists and others who were helping us move from this notion of what we talk about as pyramid logic, of the replication effect of neoliberal logic, from kind of the superstructure down to the individual, that we all have a neoliberal within us that mediates every part of our life, down to, do I read the label, and that the government decided that if I can read the label for the nutritional quality, I have enough information to make an educated choice to how do I decide where to send my child to school, rather than thinking about the collective myriad things about neoliberalism, that I can only really share wealth within my family unit. So we talk about, that's kind of a framework of how we look at where we are. And we often talk about the neoliberal logic as we're kind of all in checkmate in a way. We're kind of stuck. And then we have a way of looking at what we're invoking with this onto shifts. And we talk about a nod to spiral logic. And so what is it if we reimagine? Again, it's a way to reconstruct the individual rather as webs of relationships, rather than I am a separate self, but more I am an entangled web of relationships that you could look at even within biology or many other life sciences that are starting to show that there's far more going on here than what we imagine. And then we start to recast institutions rather than static as social ecologies. And so implications, for example, with philanthropy or even other NGOs is where you're located. Like, what about the watershed? What about the place where you are? Why is it that you're getting tax exempt status in a place that you want to be in deep relationality and kinship with, and that you're starting to understand social ecologies? And what if we saw philanthropy as a biome rather than as a sector, and that the ways that those social ecologies are working together in a terrain is a biome, and that moves together into mycelial ways rather than superstructures? And then, so we have this, I wouldn't say it's a framework, but it's kind of an offering of moving us into more of a spiral logic, more of a queering, reflexive, discursive way of seeing. And then that even moves out to what may be way too far for some philanthropists, into the notion of perhaps there's even in Gaia and Entelechy here, that we're in call and response, and that it's not that we're just fated in some sort of structuralist, agentic way, but that we are in a co-creative relationship with Gaia herself in all the ways. And this is part of why we continue to speak about onto shifts. And then the other thing you didn't ask, but I could say, is that while we really don't want to get prescriptive and we don't want to be in problems and solutions, we are offering some things of, use capital to liberate capital. Let's see more of the endowments going towards shoring up some post-capitalist infrastructure? Why not give 5 to 10-year long-term general operating support grants and be with the messiness, be with the trouble, be with the ongoing praxis of what is it to be in relationality, to what is it to be in a restorative frame, to what is it to actually acknowledge that to create, and it requires a state change. And so we don't just want to sound mystical to sound mystical. It's actually to suggest that we are at a like hitting a wall, and something else is required of us. And that state change might be an alchemical process. Elnora often talks about, that we have these different archetypes, and he's more of the assassin. That can be a state change kind of a process. And it doesn't mean it to be violent. It's to acknowledge where ego is stuck, and it's trying to free that up. And so there are things that we are talking about, not just, we don't talk about spend down, we talk spend in towards life-centric ways, and myriad other things, join up with those movements, but do it in relationality. Do it in a way that you're actively working inner on the very gaze of how you're approaching, and listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've noticed also, like in my own context of philanthropy, that writing a check for a movement or a project and isolating the act just to that really misses the mark, and that the most impactful giving is so deeply enmeshed in the relationality and the presencing and the ongoing journey in solidarity. And even if you like in my own meta-analysis of gifts we've made and effectiveness, so to speak, it's not necessarily numeric as much as when was it accompanied by those other qualities of being. So what is the current state of this temporary organizational zone that you call Transition Resource Circle? Where are you at with this work, and what's on the horizon?
Mm-hmm. Well, so we've referenced this book, this post-capitalist philanthropy. Perhaps it's worth saying the second part of it, Healing Wealth in the Time of Collapse, just because I want to say there's something that is coming around. How are we all with money, and what actually is wealth right now? And there's something about the field of money that we either are caught in a scarcity and a hoarding. And I also want to say that I very much deeply acknowledge that there are people who right now, today, don't have their daily needs met. And so we're not trying to be esoteric. We're actually trying to be in relationship with that truth. Mm-hmm. And so there's something about this work will continue to show up for what's needed. And so the book is out. We are sometimes asked to do accompaniment or advising work. So I didn't mention a couple of those foundations who are recognizing the colonial legacy of philanthropy, and this work is starting to move. And I didn't mention them because there's almost people waiting for them to make a mistake or to have the answers, and yet they're also kind of jumping. I won't say first because there's a few, but really jumping into that space of the unknown and trying to find how to do this absent our dominant culture and frames. And so the work is moving. And there are others. We're not the only ones doing this. There are many there are movements, the decolonizing wealth or reparations movement. So that's to say we're trying to listen for not just with philanthropy, but we are deeply entangled in sister projects already. Or projects is almost, I feel like we call them sister projects or cousin or the kinship, but it feels like there's an ecology of inquiries and approaches. And we're in the way I see it is we're kind of in the sowing the seeds for coming up with and finding our ways and getting lost, I would say, into the praxis, into what are the methods of our ways of being, our ways of doing, that are sowing the seeds that are going to show us what movement building looks like that is contextually relevant and sensitive to this moment. So in this way, I feel like what's next is what we've talked about before, which I would call cultures of transition, which is kind of a broader frame that includes the work of Transition Resource Circle, includes some of those coordinates of possibility that we talk about around the map, includes those that are in land-based, includes those that are already working on this in the geopolitical South, includes our sister project with Culture Hack Labs and the questions they're asking. And I would say the couple things that keep coming to me that we have to work on, and I don't know if it's Transition Resource Circle or within the psychology, is where are the other kinds of organizational forms? So that way, if we're getting precise about the principles for giving, that we actually have retention spaces for receiving in a good way, that move things more swiftly and coherently, like these fields of coherence towards post-capitalist realities. So what does that look like? And I don't mean to be wonky about lawyers and financial systems, but there is something that's really needed there.
Totally.
We keep speaking post-capitalist, and there's a part of this. I know Elnor did a really eloquent definition of what is capitalism and what is it that we're invoking when we say not temporal, not old culture, new culture, or post-capitalism. It's not what comes after capitalism or socialism. It's a whole other set of, some would call values. I often feel as states of being. And I was reflecting on what all of these look like when they're done in solidarity, in nonviolence, in compassion, in humility, in cooperation, in a cosmology of interbeingness. And so I feel like there's this constant dialogue between the spiritual and the political, between the form and the formless, between that which we can't necessarily see, but we see enacted in our ethics of how we live. And so this is where it's exciting, because it suggests that we can engineer only so far, and then there's like interstate changes that have to come and accompany it. And so this is where I also see the beautiful work of the transition pathways around organizational forms. And the other piece I was reflecting on with where we're going with this. Okay, so we'll continue doing the call and response, the circle ways, to find we're starting to write some op-eds about the book to kind of translate some of the pieces of this and put that out there. And we'll work with our sister project to do kind of a hack on philanthropy. What would these frames look like if they were kind of in centropic, life-centric framing, and what that looks like? And the other piece, I think, where we're feeling is that, back to the cultures of transition piece, that there's a longing to do something beyond philanthropy that we would call post-capitalist realities, and really look at how all of the sectors are continuing to replicate the logic and ask, what are other ways that we could see transition pathways from the Rojavas to what's happening where you live? Like what's happening when the state takes on an indigenous sovereignty movement and actually start, like, what does that look like? What does the move to bioregionalism look like? And how we might actually start to better understand these transition pathways beyond just the sector of philanthropy. And so that work is coming, and it's an interesting thing, because when you follow call and response, it's hard to say there's no linearity to it. It's more like, okay, here's what's coming through and here's how we need to be a response. And then this is what flows from that. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I want to honor you, Lynn, for all of the work that you humbly hold on behalf of the collective, and that you channel through, and honoring your ancestors and teachers and all of the traditions in which you draw from. And it's no small task that you and Elnor set out to do, in terms of really at these fundamental levels, giving us all frameworks and new ideas and pathways, and all while still trying to avoid prescriptions and frameworks. We'll put links in the show notes for everyone who's listening to these sister projects, to the op-eds, you also had a beautiful webinar series. We've touched on a number of themes here, but it's really just a teaser, a sampler of the body of work that exists. And I would really encourage anyone in the funding space, in the philanthropic space, especially if you're not tuning into what's emerging here, to please take a look. Do you have any final messages or words that you'd like to share for now?
Perhaps the final thing to say is kind kind of where we end the book is we feel like we're in this moment of a very deep, in a way, surrender and a let go. And what I mean by that is not just a new agey or I definitely find a lot of in myself wisdom tradition is kind of the way that I can show up for this work. But it's recognizing that there needs to be a surrender of our comfort, of our certainty, of our addiction to consume, and that this is part of what we're invoking within this surrender, that our kind of standards of living are something that really need to be put on a, not just let go of all of it, but like a very inner yield to this moment. And perhaps if we can do that with as much humility and grace as a culture of trauma more than initiation, that perhaps we can accept this moment as a moment of initiation, and that we're walking across a threshold collectively as a species. There's many mythologies that talk about going into the underworld, or that moment of deep threshold and what that means. And this is where I see us, if we can actually invoke that spirit of surrender in that way. And that this is a way that we can actually continue to walk with one another, walk back into right relationship with life and death, and the continuum of life and death that ever has been and is and shall be, if I can say it that way, that it's just our perception and our cultural conditioning that has had us step outside of it. And perhaps in that way, I invoked this before about the lack of certainty, but we are walking each other through some unknown times. But we can do this with more humility and grace and relationality. And love you dearly, brother, and just say a lot of thank you for the entanglement.
Lynn Murphy, thank you so much. Okay, I hope you got something of value from that conversation. For more on Transition Resource Circle, go to transitionresourcecircle.org. Check out our conversation with Alnor Lada. There's a link in the show notes. And of course, all of our episodes can be found on maearth.com. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you on the next one.